Okay, so I think we are live and on air now. Hopefully you are seeing my face, and I swear you will not be seeing my face for long, so don't be too concerned. I want to thank the Boston CFUG and Tony Garcia for inviting me to speak. Just in case you know, if you're watching this if you're watching the recording later on, I'm working with a group in Boston, so they're on Skype with me on my tablet over here. So they'll be feeding me questions every now and then. So if you see me glance or say I'm waiting for them, that's the reason why. And actually, that's what I'm going to do real quick to make sure that the group there can hear me. All right. Can you hear me okay? And as soon as I get the okay from them, we'll switch to screen share and get the thing started. I'm just a bit worried because it says 0 viewers, but I think they're okay. We'll see. Just give me a few more seconds here. No. Okay. I see one viewer. All right, this is an experiment. Here we go. Okay. Sweet. So Boston, you can hear me okay? Can hear you fine. All right. Yeah, I think the Hangouts webpage will not automatically refresh sometimes when you're looking at it. So hopefully no one else is suffering from that as well. I have one viewer, and that's all I need. So Boston, hello, and I'm going to go ahead and switch to screen share. All right, so Tony, if you could tell me if you're seeing my Chrome browser, and I know you are a little bit behind me in real time. Oh, sweet. Okay, that's great. So maybe the lag won't be so bad. All right, so I'm gonna get started. And again, Tony in Boston, just let me know if you see any problems. All right, so let's talk about static sites, or as I call it, bringing Web 1.0 back. My name is Raymond Camden. I am a developer advocate for IBM. I've been here for a few months now. My focus is on a couple of our cool products, Mobile First, Blue Mix. I do a lot with Apache, Cordova / PhoneGap, and I like web standards in general. So I like the web. I like HTML. I like JavaScript. I like all those fun APIs and cool stuff. I am blogging at raymondcamden.com. I'll be posting the recording up there and any assets. And if you have any questions about this presentation, there is a feedback form, or an email, I should say, on my blog that you can use to reach out to me. And I tweet at Raymond Camden. I encourage you to follow me because I swear I only talk about serious stuff on Twitter, not Star Wars or kittens or things like that. All of the assets for this presentation, the demos, the actual slide deck, can be found on GitHub. And if you don't have time to record this URL down, it'll be on my blog, raymondcamden.com, so you won't have to worry about quickly copying this down. So the general game plan for how we're going to do this presentation. We're going to talk about the why. You know, static websites sound kind of boring. They sound kind of simple and not very powerful. So why in the heck would you even consider using them? We'll talk about the how, specifically about one way of working with static websites. And we'll also talk about bringing dynamic back. So, you know, once you go static, you know, are you losing everything dynamic, or can you still do some things dynamic? Unfortunately, this is not as cool as bringing sexy back, but it's a bit more practical. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about hosting options. So one of the benefits of going static is that your hosting needs get a heck of a lot simpler. So we'll talk about some good options in that regard. All right, so let's talk a bit about why. Why would you consider moving to a static site? So I think most of the people in the room in Boston know that I was a Cold Fusion person for a very long time. Still do Cold Fusion every now and then. I also do Node. I have spent, probably 15 plus years building dynamic web apps using a variety of application servers, primarily Cold Fusion, but everything you see on screen there are things that I have played with. I've even built sites using Microsoft Access, and I'm not ashamed to say it. It's pretty darn easy to use. We have a lot of different tools to build really powerful, really complex web applications. So the idea of giving all that up seems a bit silly. It seems a bit crazy. Why would you give up all that power to move to essentially nothing, to just files? Well, there's a variety of reasons. Number one is that things break. What you're seeing on screen there is the WordPress Air. I ran into that when I switched my blog from Cold Fusion to WordPress. I thought it would just kind of magically work, no problem, and it ended up not working. I had to do a lot of surgery, I guess, on the server and a lot of tweaking to get things working right, to get PHP working, to get Apache serving things up right. I eventually got it working, but it was kind of a pain in the rear. I used Cold Fusion for a very long time. I think I'm very good at it, and it still would crash on me. Certainly not every day, certainly not all the time, but basically every single thing that you have in play is one more thing that can and will break at some point in the future. And sometimes what we have is just plain overkill, right? So, I would run sites using SQL Server, which, can take like a bazillion transactions a day or a minute or whatever. An enterprise version of Cold Fusion, which is, 10 grand or so. I had a lot of power, sometimes behind websites that were getting maybe 50 page views a day. And that is just insane. That's just way, way more power than I need for something that's not getting a lot of traffic. Or maybe it's talking to a database and that data is changing once a month or so. So all of those tools were things that were nice to have, but I really didn't need. And honestly, I was just using them because they were there. Another big change is obviously the whole mobile revolution, right? So for some people, they're finding that what their business is, whatever that may be, sales, social, whatever, that their main users are moving off of their website and onto a mobile app. Now, I'm certainly not saying that the web is dead or the web is going away. I'm just saying that in some cases, you may be doing less on your .com and more in an app on a mobile device, which, by the way, can be built with web technology. So certainly the web is not going anywhere. But you may find that there's less need for a website since most of your people are using the application instead. Your website may actually end up just being essentially a support portal for the mobile app, a simple set of documentation, facts, stuff like that. And then finally, browsers, they don't suck as much. They still kind of suck in some regards. They still have their issues. But things that we used to do on an application server can possibly be done on the client with JavaScript. If you look at modern browsers now, they have a lot baked into them. We've seen games on the browser. You have deep data storage options on the browser. If your application server was essentially just storing data for a user, you can actually store that on the user's browser instead of setting up a SQL server on your back end. Browsers can do quite a bit more than they used to be able to do. So if you look at a lot of modern web development, and I should put that in quotes because that's like a big concept, right? You may see multiple web servers, multiple application servers, multiple database servers, multiple caching servers. you can get really, really complex at this layer, machine after machine after machine. Or another option is files. And I mean, like, really, like, just files. And to be clear, I'm not saying that this is going to always be possible. If you are a bank and you're letting people log in to look at their accounts and move money around, certainly this is not the case. But when I looked at my stable or my portfolio of websites, there were many of them where I was actually able to say, you know what, this does not need an application on the back end. This does not need Cold Fusion or does not need a Node.js server. It really just needs plain, simple, static files. So I like simple. My life is complex enough. So one of the reasons that this whole area, this area of static websites was so enticing to me was because I like having less to worry about. So that's kind of the why. Let's talk a bit about the how. I see two kind of main broad options in terms of how you can work with a static website, either with desktop programs, and by that I mean things like, for example, and it's been a while, but I believe Dreamweaver used to have the option of creating layouts and things and allowing you to essentially define a layout and create web pages, and it would actually output those web pages wrapped in that layout for you. And there's other programs I've seen as well, especially on the Mac, that will create static websites on your computer itself. But the thing that I'm more concerned about, and the main focus for this presentation, are actually generators. These are programs that you will run to actually generate a static website from dynamic web pages. So generators typically do a couple of main things. They'll give you some form of template language. So if you know Cold Fusion or PHP or Node, then you're already kind of familiar with this concept of being able to embed logic into a particular HTML page. So for example, I want to output the current time. So Cold Fusion has a way of doing that. PHP has a way of doing that. All these app servers have a way of saying, take this particular token and output the current time. So static site generators will also have a way of doing that. There's a lot of different template languages out there, so there's a wide variety in how you actually write this particular code. They'll also give you some way to work with data. So that's kind of abstract. As a concrete example, they may allow you to define a variable, let's say site name. So I can say my site name is Ray Likes Cats. So a static site generator will allow you to define that data and then use it within your site so that you can change that variable in one place and see it output everywhere that variable is used. So again, that's not really rocket science if you have an application server, but this is a kind of a powerful concept when we're working with something that's going to output flat files at the end. They will typically give you a way to preview, so you can actually run a particular server and see, here's my file, here's the template language outputting some particular data, and I could see it in my browser and test. And then finally, they will all typically then give you a way to say, okay, I'm done, writing my code. Now give me my simple flat files. Now, in terms of options, there's quite a few. These two websites actually give you a directory of static site generators. If you open up the first one, you could see that there are almost 400 different options. So there's quite a few different ways of skinning the cat, so to speak. Today, I'm going to focus on just one of those options, Harp. Now, Harp was the first static site generator I ever played with. I really, really like it. It's a very simple, very friendly static site generator. Today, I'm not necessarily, though, trying to sell you on Harp. Harp is not actually my favorite. My favorite is Jekyll. but I find Jekyll to be quite complex, whereas Harp is quite a bit simpler. But again, I don't want to sell you on Harp. There's 396 other different ones out there for you to look at. Instead, I kind of want to talk to you a bit about Harp, kind of show you how it feels to work with a generator and how the output comes up. And if you like that, then certainly, if Harp's template language looks weird to you, you could pick one of the many other different options out there. All right, quick drink of water. All right, so let's talk about Harp. So first off, you can find Harp at harpjs.com. It works everywhere, so Mac, Windows, Linux, etc. I'll point that out because I mentioned that I like Jekyll a bit more, and Jekyll does not work on Windows, so that's just kind of something to keep in mind. In terms of the template languages that Harp supports, it supports EJS, Jade, and Markdown. So if you know any of those, then you can use Harp. If you don't know any of those, you can learn them rather easy. And my main focus today will be on EJS. It also has some preprocessors baked in. So if you use, for example, LessSass or Stylus to write your CSS, Harp can automatically convert those into regular CSS files. It also supports converting CoffeeScript into JavaScript. Now, I don't do CSS myself. Well, I do CSS sometimes, but not too much. So I don't make use of any of those particular features within Harp, and I really don't like CoffeeScript. But again, that's 100% optional. You don't have to use those. Installation is done via npm. Obviously, the sudo would only be on OS X. I know some people don't like using sudo, but as long as you have npm installed, you can get Harp by just doing npm install -g harp. So once you've done that, that will give you the command line interface. And again, this is pretty common to all the generators out there. The CLI gives you a couple options. You can use init to create a new project. And to be clear, you don't have to actually use init. Harp can work with any set of web files. So if you have a folder with a index.html file, you can use that with Harp. The main thing that init will do is kind of give you a few files to start off with. So while you're learning, it's a great way to just kind of see how things lay out. You can also use init to grab a boilerplate from Harp's Git repo, and they have a couple of different examples, like for example, a blog, I believe, a couple other ones as well. And you could check their website for more information, but essentially using init just kind of gives you a hello world starting point. Now, once you have a folder, then you can use server to actually fire up Harp and run a little mini web server from that folder. So this lets you build your Harp site out, work with data and stuff like that, and see the live output. If you know Cold Fusion or PHP, this is essentially your Cold Fusion or PHP server that's running your files and converting the tokens into HTML that's sent to the browser. Last option is compile, and this is how you would actually take those dynamic web pages and convert them into a flat file. All right, so a quick example of how this looks. Go to the command line here, and I will do harp init July 1st, just give it a folder. And again, it kind of grabs a default boilerplate. I will go into July 1st and do harp server. And I apologize if I type very loud. I'm like an angry typist. Okay, so now it's running a web server on port 9000. You could tweak that port if you need to, but I will quickly go to 9000. And you can see, welcome to Harp. This is yours to enjoy. If we look at this in the editor, we see 4 different files. Now, the default boilerplate for Harp uses a template language called Jade. I really, 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 really hate Jade. I just don't like it. But essentially, what Jade is doing here with the H1 then space, it's like a shorthand version of HTML. So it's actually going to wrap this and output H1 and then close the H1. Now I'm getting a request to make the terminal a bit bigger. I definitely will when I get back into terminal. And this H3 here just essentially wraps it. The other interesting aspect of Harp is that I have a layout file in this case called _layout.jade. And this essentially allows me to wrap all of my pages with one particular template. So if I were to come in here and say, I really hate Jade, and save it, I come back, there it is on top, and it actually converted the I into italics. So this should make a simple paragraph. Again, I don't like Jade, I don't use it, so forgive me for that little typo. But basically, what you're seeing here should be pretty similar then to working with Cold Fusion or PHP. I have a language, in this case, it's Jade. The server is converting it into HTML, and if we were to view the HTML, just to prove that I'm not making this up, we'll go into network, reload, and switch to all. And there is the HTML, not the actual Jade. And in fact, I can go in here and request index.html, and it works because Harp knows that index.jade represents index.html and just serves it up for me. Okay, so that is the Jade version. And again, I really, really don't like Jade, so I try to avoid it at all costs. The other option, and give me 1 second here, is EJS. And let me get into that, and I'll make this a bit bigger. There we go. All right. So this is the EJS version. In this case, I'm not really outputting any data. It's just simple HTML. But if we look at the layout, this is the token for outputting, in this case, the body of the page. It looks a lot like ASP, classic ASP, which may be a mark against it, but I find it simpler to work with than Jade. As an example of what you can do within it, I can actually embed JavaScript in this. And in this case, I'm doing new date, get full year to output the current date. I'm going to switch back, Control-C, Control-C, make my font a little bit bigger as requested, and give me 1 second to, there we go. And hopefully that is a bit more readable. If not, just let me know over there in Boston. So I'm just going to the EJS version and running it from here. So it should look pretty much the same, except now I have a date in there coming from my layout. So for the most part, this is just like working with an application server, right? So I have variables and I have something dynamic, I have a layout, and I'm getting HTML out. The powerful part is when we come here and say Harp compile, and we'll say the current directory, and we will output it to example static. That's kind of arbitrary, but there you go. So what I've just done, so I've asked Harp to look at my files and convert them to static HTML. If I go in my editor to where I just created it, there it is, example static, you can see I don't have EJS files anymore. I just have HTML. Here is the one I just created. So you could see the index page. You could see the layout. If I realize that I've made some mistake, for example, I forgot a title, I can go back into my server or my Harp folder, go into the layout and just hard code something in. Title, this is a test live, save it, and then literally go back, recompile it, and I could automate all this as well. Go look at the example output, and there is the title in there. So just in case that didn't really kind of click, what I have is essentially like a mini little app server that I could do to make my development easier. but the output is just simple static HTML files. Very nice and simple with absolutely no dependencies on my production server. So going forward with that, in terms of organization, Harp has a couple of different rules. In general, kind of Harp tries to run with whatever you have, but it also allows you to create hidden assets and files. So you can actually put things in a Harp project that you don't want in the output. Anything that you put with an underscore in front will be hidden automatically. Or you can even use a public folder beneath your main folder to actually store your web files. This allows you to create a project, for example, and put, Photoshop PSDs and other assets in different folders, and have public act as, where your real web server is. So for the most part, this is just organization. So let me actually go to Explorer for this. Not Explorer, I've been using my Windows machine a bit too much. Just to make this a bit more obvious. So this folder here is an example of the default Harp output. It's just files directly within the folder as is, and that works. The public example is a little bit different. So in this case, I've created a folder called public. I've actually built my site in there, and then everything else outside of that will not be in the final output. And the harp.json file, I'll explain in a few seconds, but this is typically the way that you'll organize a Harp project, but it's not required. Now, I mentioned the ability to work with data. I said all static site generators support this in some way or another. Harp is no exception. It supports global data. So for people doing Cold Fusion, that's a bit like the application scope or things that you would use across the site. And it also supports metadata, and this will be more of a folder-based or a type of data system. So global data is stored in your harp.json file, and that's the one I just showed. One kind of odd quirk about Harp is that when you have that public folder, the file name is called harp.json, and when you don't, it's underscore harp.json. Now, I've reported a bug to the Harp people to fix it because that's unnecessarily confusing. But if you see me kind of going back and forth between underscore harp.json and harp.json, that's why. So as an example of how you would use it, you create a JSON file, you create a key called globals, and then you create variables. And really, you can make whatever you want: site name, email, boilerplate, legal, user agreement, essentially any type of textual data that can live in a JSON file can live in your global variables. So as an example of that, if I go too fast, just let me know. This is a Jade example where within Jade you embed variables by using a pound bracket variable name. In this case, I have site name, and there is my harp.json file with site name. In my layout, I'm using a different variable, email. If we run this, and that was data 1, go to Harp server, back to my browser, we'll see there is the email address and there is the variable. And obviously, if I go in here and say, let's change this to Ray's World, save it, and reload, get the new variable. What's nice about this is that when I actually compile this, I do harp compile this directly into data 1, we'll call it output, we will see, all right, there, that those variables get put into the static HTML. So any type of situation where you may have a variable for the name, or again, like a global email address, a good static site generator will support some way of defining that data, using it within your templates while you're testing, and then having it exist in these static files when done. And this is just how Harp supports it. The other option you have is something called metadata. And essentially, metadata is associated with a particular folder. So for example, for a blog, I may have a folder called entries. I may have a folder called products. I may have a folder called executive team. And if I create a file in that folder called _data.json, Harp will associate that particular data with those particular files. So when you do that, if you follow a couple of special rules, Harp will say, you know what, when you're looking at a file in that folder, I'm going to associate the data with that particular request. So that sounds a bit kind of vague. So we'll look at a quick example of this in action. So here's my data 2, and I have a couple of files at the root level, and I have an articles folder with a couple of different files. I'll open up one. This is just one more example of EJS. So I have a file with a little bit of HTML. By the way, Harp also supports include, so that's all you're seeing there is a simple way to include some logic into my template. Now, what's interesting about this is that I also have my data file for my articles. In this case, I define a title, a simple excerpt, and some categories for each of my articles. Once I've done that, something kind of cool happens. I'll go ahead and run this first and then show how it works. Do Harp server again from data 2. All right, so this time, once we run, I have a simple blog. Notice my title is saying Ray's World, data 2, that's a site. When I click on an article, now my title says article 1, and I have my categories. I can go back home and look at other stuff as well. So essentially, kind of a mini database here. The code is not that complex. And again, this is EJS. If you don't like it, you can do this in J. But basically, what Harp did was took that metadata and made it available to my EJS code under a public.articles, and articles comes from the folder name _data structure. So because that was an object of keys, essentially, I can loop over it and create that list of blog entries that you saw. So I'm creating a link, I'm including the title, and I'm also including the excerpt as well. One special thing to note, I'm including that object key. So we'll go back to the data, 1, 2, 3. Notice that this actually matches my file names minus the extension, 123.ejs. See the title here, article 1. If we look at the layout file, this is my title, and I'm using a simple EJS token to say output the title variable. What Harp did is that it said when you were on that particular article page, 1.ejs, it recognized that the file name matched the same key in your data, and it made title essentially a variable that existed for the layout. That's why when I'm on the home page, title will go to, I know I'm jumping around a bit here, the global variable and be replaced with the local variable when I'm on that particular file. So essentially, Harp is kind of recognizing that I'm requesting a file and then it matches something in my data.json. And hopefully that kind of made sense. When I'm all done building this, I can still output this to simple HTML, and everything will come out as flat files. So in case you're curious what the process then would be for adding to a blog, I can come in here and say, make a new file called for EJS. I'll just say hello world. And then I would go in my data and just add one more. I'm just going to copy and paste from this just to make it simple. This is article 4 and blah. So that is definitely some typing. Let's make sure it's actually working. So that's some typing. It's not some nice CMS, but again, I get the benefit of having flat files when I'm done. I don't have to worry about running MySQL or SQL Server or, Lord forbid, Oracle as well. So that is data. There's more things that Harp supports, including doing things in dev versus product. There's a current scope that tells you where you are. This is pretty handy for navigation. So back on my little fake blog here, notice that on the home page, it's just the list of entries. When I click an entry, I have a home link. My layout file is actually handling that by saying, if I'm not on the home page, add this link. So again, just kind of the feature of Harp. You can also look at directory contents. So if you want to build, for example, an image gallery or some such, you can do that. Harp also has 404 support, and I put a question mark there. So during development, if you request something that's not there, foo.html, it will run a file called 404.ejs or .j or even .html. Obviously, when you go to flat files, there's no built-in support for 404 logic. Wherever you deploy your site, you have to ensure that you set things up so that when you request a file that's not there, it goes to the 404.html file. You can also do things like run multiple Harp servers at one. It also supports doing non-HTML stuff. Pretty much everything I showed you was, so-and-so.html. You could build an RSS feed with Harp that works just fine. You could also run Harp from within Node if you want to. And if you do that, you could even do basic authentication by just modifying the global data file harp.json. All right, so if you're interested in some real sites that I have built using Harp, Cold Fusion Cookbook. This was a Cold Fusion website using MySQL. It's now entirely flat files. If you're curious about the Harp stuff behind that, I can show that to you or share that with you later. But it was kind of an interesting achievement to convert it. CF Cookbook, unfortunately, just wasn't getting the attention. It wasn't getting submissions. It didn't need to be dynamic anymore. And honestly, you really can't tell that it's any different compared to how it used to be. So I still have entries. I still have data there. It's still being picked up by Google. It's still working, but this is 100% flat files. All right, quick sip of water. So again, if you want to learn more, harpjs.com. And again, if you saw that EJS code and said it looked horrible, it reminded you too much of ASP, and you hate the Jade as well, this is just one particular example. Other generators have different template languages, and you can find whatever one you prefer. Harp, their site also has a good set of recipes in terms of, how do I do so-and-so with Harp. It's a great place to learn, more examples of working with Harp JS. All right, so now that I've talked to you about working with static files, how do we actually get dynamic stuff back? So you've gone to flat files and you realize, oh my God, I need like a form. I totally forgot that I have to build a form in there. How do I handle forms when it's just flat files? I want to do comments. I want to do search, for example, or calendars, or I have some other abstract data that I need to have tied to a CMS or some database or whatever. How do I get this stuff back? Well, the good news is that there's options for all of these. So in terms of forms, there's a bunch of different options. The best one probably is Wufoo. It has a really, really nice interface for designing forms and real simple embed type thing. It's not free, and that's not a bad thing, but I'm just going to point that out. Google will allow you to create and embed forms as well. Another nice option is FormKeep. I'll show you an example of FormKeep real quick. So nice thing about FormKeep is that essentially you create the new form on their website, and you really just have to copy 2 lines of code. And what's really nice is that they handle everything. So they will redirect back to your site. They will store responses. They will send you an email. They'll do spam checking, all type of fun stuff. You could see some examples on a test that I used to have on my blog. And again, this is pretty nice. This is also not free. You can definitely test for free, but their plans start at $7 a month. And then finally, you could do what I've done in a few cases. I've given up on the form and just switched to a simple mail to, or basically it said, if you want to contact me, here's my email address. And that's, not always a bad option. So as an example, I am using a Google Doc form on one of my websites, JavaScriptCookbook.com. This is also a static site. This one's built in Jekyll. And my submit form is baked via Google. And I could probably get rid of that background so it doesn't look, quite so obviously this is an embed. But you know what? It works. I get validation and all that jazz, and I still have flat files on the actual server. So in terms of comments, probably most people know Disqus Livefire, I think that's F-Y-R-E, but my main one is Disqus. It's pretty easy to embed. My blog is using it. Cold Fusion Cookbook is using it. You can see the embed right there. And literally, once you sign up with them, they give you a block of code, you drop it in the file, and it's done. And that works just fine with Harp, Jekyll, any static site generator. You could put that in your layout and then have comments on your static website. Search. My favorite option for this is the Google Custom Search Engine. This is another free tool from them where you could define a search engine that's tied to one particular .com. I'm using this on Cold Fusion Cookbook, and you probably can't tell. So I search for email. It's rendering. So, okay, the ads by Google, that kind of makes it obvious. But I have search now, and Google, I've heard, is pretty good at search. So you know what? I'm more than willing to let them do it. I will point out one kind of weird thing about their custom search engine. You will need to tweak the options. Out of the box, all of the result links will pop open a new tab, which is just silly. But obviously you can tweak that, and you will want to tweak that. And you can modify the CSS and other things as well. I think you can even turn the ads off. I think I kept it on there so I can earn $1 or $2 or a penny or two from here. But it's pretty easy to use. I will say making it work with a form so you can type here takes a tiny bit of code. And I'll just show you an example of that real quick on Cold Fusion Cookbook. Search. Where is it? Yeah, right here. So I had to use their documentation essentially, but that one tag is what makes the form work. It's what makes it, say, hey, if I see form input called search terms, you use that when you do the embed by default. So that's search. In terms of calendars, there's a couple of different examples. The Google one is probably the easiest. Eventbrite is really, for events. Full Calendar is not really a service per se. It's a jQuery plugin. So you would need to edit the data file yourself. Although I believe they have a plugin to support the Google Calendar as well. I haven't checked it in a while, so I could be wrong on that. But as a quick example of that, here is how I embedded it in this little HTML file. Essentially, they gave me the embed code. I copied and pasted, and you could actually look at this is my personal calendar embedded in the site. Here's my site, and there's the content. And again, they have options to tweak the CSS, defaults, colors, all that jazz. But what's nice is that a client can actually put their particular events in here, and then it would just kind of show up in the iframe automatically. And then finally, if you have more complex data needs and you still really want to stick with a static site, there's a couple of services out there, Parse and Firebase as just some examples, where they will store all the data for you and you use JavaScript to essentially get all of it. I think this is probably pushing it a little bit too far, but it is an option that you can possibly consider. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying it's an option that you would use with caution, for example. All right, so you've got your flat files, you have your nice little mini app server locally to allow you to kind of build stuff out. How do you actually get those flat files to the public web? What are your options? Well, obviously, you can use a traditional web server. So if you have a host, then you call them up, you get a server, a simple server, and you have them install Apache. They tell you FTP, and you just FTP that stuff up, and you're done. That's one option. I think an easier option is to use some of the static file hosting companies. So Amazon, you've probably heard of them, has an S3 service for storing files. They also support website hosting. And these links here are just links to the docs. It's kind of funny. So they make it super easy to turn a bucket into a website. But you have to get some obscure XML file to turn on the permission. So every time I do it, I know where the one-click button is, and then I have to Google for the little XML file to put in. So I don't know why they've made that one click as well, but it takes 5 minutes, and then you have a bucket that can be used for your static website. And those sites listed there are just various things that I've built that I've hosted on S3. Every month I get a bill from them for about 5 to 8 cents. So I don't think they've actually billed my credit card yet because I don't think I've hit more than $5. Now, those sites on there obviously are not heavy traffic. CF Cookbook, I think, is about 500 page views a week. So it's not nothing per se, but it's a good option and it's a cheap option. Another one is Google Cloud Storage. I have one site up there, a little demo I built called GitHub Health. And they are also pretty much just as cheap as Amazon. Honestly, I couldn't tell you who's cheaper. When the bills come in and they're pennies, I typically don't really care. And that link is for the docs as well. The last option I want to show you is a really, really, really cool one called Surge. And this is by the same company that built Harp. So once you've installed Surge and installed via NPM, it's going to kill this. Surge allows you to deploy from the command line. So if we look at one of our outputs, so let's say data one output. So this is one of the examples that I spit out from my Harp site. So you see it's .html, nothing dynamic. So it's flat files. I do Surge. I've already logged in, so I don't have to log in again. It's asking me to confirm the project path, so my current directory. I hit enter. It's picking a random domain, and it's live. So just in case that's not clear, I just published a folder to the internet in about 5 seconds. If you go to soar-anger.surge.sh in your browser, you will see that Harp site. Now that was random. I could actually use a one particular domain, once I decided on what my site is. Once I've done that, I can make that command line go even faster because I won't pick a random domain. In case you're curious, JavaScript Cookbook is being served via Surge, and it is free. Now, they do have a paid tier with some more advanced options, but for testing stuff, I mean, you can imagine sharing this with a client. And I could also tear it down with one command line call as well. But being able to share a folder like this on the internet in seconds is amazingly powerful. So it's a really, really cool option that you may want to consider. So just to kind of wrap things up a bit with some links, that first link there is from my buddy, Brian Rinaldi. He's also pretty passionate about static sites. And on that repo, he's done something kind of cool. He's built the same website in multiple different generators. So you can actually take this repo and compare different products and see how they solve the exact same solution. And so finally, I also have a set of links, and these are all things that I built as flat files, just to give you some, ideas of the things you can do without an application server. And that is it. So everyone who is watching live, thank you very much. Everyone who's watching the recording, thank you as well. As I said at the beginning, this presentation was for a user group in Boston, and they are online with me live now with Skype. So I'm going to let them tell me if they have any questions. Now, they're also probably about 30 seconds or so behind. So there may be a bit of a lag here as I wait to see if they have any questions. And if they don't, then we're just going to kind of wrap things up. So I'm going to stop sharing, and that won't kill the presentation. But I'll put my face back on, and I should have warned you, sorry, not to be too scary. And I'm just saying, do you have any questions? And again, thank you to everyone who's watching this. And I'm just going to wait a minute or two to see if the group there in Boston has any questions, and take some water while I wait. And in case you're curious, yes, that's a butt ton of Star Wars toys behind me. They're actually all around me in the office, but my webcam is in the monitor, so I won't be panning that around. All right, so there are some questions. And again, we have a bit of a lag here. So if you're watching this recorded, I apologize for any oddities with that. So I'm just waiting now for the group to ask me the question. By the way, I'm using Skype on the Microsoft Surface tablet, which is really darn good. I'm really impressed with it. So the question is, what's the most complex site that you've seen that's from a generator? I actually don't have a good answer for that. I can talk about my sites. The most complex one for me was the Cold Fusion Cookbook and the JavaScript Cookbook. And the part in it that was complex is dealing with categories. And what do I mean by that? So on a blog, you'll have entries, and you saw the example of Harp, and that's not too complex. But typically, you may have a category page. So I want a page of all the blog articles concerning Star Wars, one concerning Star Trek, etc. So static site generators typically require real files. In an app server, I'd have something like category.cfm or .php with a URL parameter that would say, oh, I want this particular category. A static site generator, though, wants flat files. So when I handled categories for the Cold Fusion Cookbook, I did actually generate one file for each category. Now, that wasn't that big of a deal per se, but mentally it was a bit of a stumbling block in terms of like, why am I, and I apologize for not closing Hangouts, for why, I'm not screen sharing anymore. It was a mental block for me. So I can only talk about, I guess, my complex examples. So I'm seeing one more question. That's an awesome question, Tony. The question is, you talked about Jekyll. I'm considering my options for static sites, and the reason I'm hesitant about Jekyll is that to write plugins, you have to do Ruby. So the reason I like Jekyll is that it has a plugin system. So if Jekyll doesn't support something, you can do a plugin for it, and I like having that option. So I always know that if I hit a brick wall in this one little area, I have a way out of it. Unfortunately, you have to use Ruby, and I don't know Ruby. I will say I built a plugin in Ruby for JavaScript Cookbook, it was a bit hard to do just because I don't know Ruby, but I made my way through it. It wasn't, it wasn't too hard. And I'm not that smart. So, if you don't know and don't like Ruby, that's something to be concerned about. But A, I'd be willing to bet you probably won't always need a plugin. And B, if you do need a plugin, you can probably, power through it and get it done. So the question then follow-up is perfect. Is does Harp support plugins? It does not. I've definitely passed that on to the people behind Harp, and I hope that they add that. I've also been asking which other ones I've looked at. I've recently looked at Hugo, which is built using Go, which is a bit weird. And I've also looked at Wintersmith. I didn't care for Hugo or Wintersmith. I didn't give them a lot of time. I just kind of gave them a first blush, like, oh, I don't like it. It's different. So that may not be entirely fair. But right now, my primary experience is Jekyll and Harp. And I've not looked at one called Roots yet. I recommend to look at Brian Rinaldi's GitHub repo, because again, he has multiple different generators solving the exact same problem, which is a powerful way to compare different products. Anything else from Boston? Anything else? I'm just waiting. Again, Boston's a bit behind, lag-wise, not behind in general. That's it. Oh, well, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Boston. Thank you to everyone who's watching online, and hope you learned something and got something from this. If you have any feedback at all, positive or negative, negative's fine as well. Just drop me a line, and have a good night.